Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jen. I'm your host of Blockchain Banter. And I'm here with Angela, founder of TokenEngineering Academy and researcher at GovXS, and Mark Richardson, project lead at Bancor and Carbon DeFi. We are discussing or debating, maybe even, are DAOs dead? And I know that that might be a little bit, slightly controversial for some, especially those who have been in this industry for so long, and maybe not as much as I might be thinking as well. So, Angela, I want to start with you. I invited you on this call specifically because I had seen some research that you were doing in regards to DAOs. I'm going to share the link here for all of our viewers as well so that they can go ahead and see that. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about token engineering and, what it actually is, how you're, your role at GovXS and the research that you've been doing, and a little bit about this paper, and we can really jump into the details of it.
Okay, yeah, first of all, thanks for inviting me. Great to be here. My background, I'm active in crypto since 2016. I started actually in venture development and VCs in the crypto sector back then for decentralizing energy systems. And I got excited about incentives and incentive mechanism where Web3 provides us with a design space that is not feasible in Web2 and unseen opportunities here. And since I know how hard it is to find product market fit and how important it is to understand motivations of all agents, all stakeholders in the system, I got hooked by incentive design and token engineering. Token engineering to be this new discipline combining computer science, software engineering, economics, game theory, the idea that we are creating systems and we can tackle the challenges here using methods from systems engineering, running simulations, understanding the dynamics in the system, where this could break, where we run into edge cases, and then also the socioeconomic, socio-technical systems, the human behavior, incentives, decision space, and governance. Because in crypto land, we have token-based governance. So we define how much voting power someone has in a ecosystem via tokens, or we grant access rights. And this has been part of my journey since 2020 when we started TE Academy, because you can't study something like that on no university today. And over the past 4 years, we've created a dedicated curriculum, TE Fundamentals. It's available as public goods online at tokenengineering.net. We created a platform that was live until November with 5K students, more than 1,700 NFTs for graduates minted, and an awesome community,
So amazing.
mentors, lecturers, students. And we are still active, currently preparing the token engineering track at EFCC 8 in Cannes in June, July. And since July last year, I'm also a member of the research collective called GovXS. And we are focusing on token-based governance, decision-making systems, with people from social choice, computational social choices, like the traditional academic discipline exploring voting systems, and Web3 people, mechanism designers, and data scientists to build simulations and explore the robustness of a certain voting design. And this is what we did over the past month for Optimism Retro Funding, amongst others. And now, just recently, exploring metrics-based voting, which should solve some of the most pressing challenges we face today in governance. But I stop here.
No, that's awesome. First of all, congratulations on everything with TE Academy. because I've been following it, and this isn't the first time you've been our guest, right? So one, it's wonderful to have you back and to always hear about what it is you're working on and what sort of research you're doing, and so, really the conclusions that you're coming to and how you got there. And I think that's going to be a lot of what this is also. You're talking about this new potential voting system. And I think what I really want to do is kind of dig into, and Mark, here's the thing. You are the project lead at Bancor, and Bancor is a decentralized protocol with an active DAO, right? So I think having had a DAO since what, 2018, 19, 20? Before 2020, because that's when I joined the community. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are as well, especially in regards to the research that Angela is doing and what you're experiencing firsthand leading a project that is, governed by its DAO. So please, jump in here at any point in time. I think what I maybe want to start with is just kind of open discussion. Angela, you can refer to the research, Mark, your experience here. But when we speak about DAOs, what do we think works and what what isn't working in your opinions? And either of you can jump in here.
I think there's a long list, but to me, what's so new is that many DAO members are so frustrated about DAOs, and communities start to question, does this DAO whole decentralization thing, in terms of voting, everybody has a say, really help us in growing our ecosystem? Does it really provide value? And I think, every DAO faces a journey from starting with great enthusiasm and a lot of contributors, and then activities slow down, and you have just a tiny community and voting participation, and people don't feel that they really can impact the journey of a DAO anymore. And slowly but surely, people get disappointed, less active, and then we see all sorts of voting biases, voting problems. So that's my general point of view. I think that's not a surprise, and we certainly have to solve a lot of challenges. But I think we are at a turning point with DAOs, I'd say.
Mark, you want to add to that as well? I know I have my own thoughts of what Angela was saying, but I, of course, want to hear yours.
Sure. I can take I think a slightly more specific view, which is that I think in the beginning, right, which is when I first joined DAOs. Like, remember, I'm the project lead at Bancor now, but I wasn't always. In my journey with Bancor began as a community member, as just a DAO, voter, even before the DAO, right? Just someone who would, write things down and, share it with others. So even before there was a formal, voting mechanism, I think that the Bancor DAO was in full throttle, even more so then than it is today, without, voting rights and things like that. And certainly back then, and this is, 2020 leading into 2021, the view, I think, that certainly that I had, and from my perspective, that the project Bancor had of DAOs was modeled after what the development atmosphere in blockchains in general looked like, right? So, like, Bitcoin came out of nowhere. No one knows who Satoshi Nakamoto is. There are no voting rights in Bitcoin. But it still is run and continuing, like, its development and maintenance is continued by people who are rallied to the cause and who actually want to do work for it. And I think that was the perspective then. And, Ethereum, I think, even today, even without a proper, DAO structure, and I think this is one of the things that people often overlook about Ethereum, is that it really is, despite the fact that it's got a foundation, despite the fact that it's got a figurehead, and so on. It really is a DAO operation. There are people that propose certain things, and they work on different aspects of the Ethereum, the underlying blockchain protocol on their own, and then propose it. And people work on token standards, in private, and then eventually decide to write up an EIP and sort of showcase what they've done. And it's really up to the Ethereum developer community as to whether or not those standards are accepted. And it works really very, very well. But it's sort of the exception. I think when the Bancor DAO was launched, it had a similar expectation, that we had complex, complex financial products and things that a bunch of different levers and dials and things on protocols that people could control, and that people would show up to govern this thing. And it really was put in the hands of its community. Like the Bancor Foundation was pretty was fairly all in on the idea of a DAO, right? It wanted to hand over complete control of the project to voters, and basically check itself out. And I don't mean that in sort of a cavalier way. Obviously, in terms of financing development, things like that, and legal overhead and that sort of thing, the foundation was very happy to continue its involvement. But in terms of deciding what the smart contracts did and what the project did, it really did go all in, more than any other project I've ever seen, on DAO control. And it didn't go very well. The assumption that people in the DAO would show up and represent the best interests of that protocol because they have purchased those voting rights and things like that, turned out to not be very good assumptions at all. And I think that this is why things like incentive mechanism design, and Angela is much more of an expert on this than I am, and there are lots of people inside the token engineering community that spend an enormous amount of time looking at these kinds of things and what is the likely outcome, right, from a specific DAO model and how people are going to behave in those kinds of systems. But certainly from my experience, what you end up doing with a DAO with any incentive structure, especially if the incentive structure is under the influence of the DAO itself, is that it is eventually and without exception exploited by the DAO itself. And I think that while Bancor's experience with this is certainly testament to that, it's not the exception. I think that what we now refer to as governance exploits has become much more sort of standard. Like people are sort of paying attention to the clock, right? Like how long is it going to be before someone attempts something like this? We've seen it, I will rattle off some protocols, like Balancer went through this, and they handled it relatively well. But there was someone that assumed so much governance control that they could direct all of the Balancer emissions towards themselves. This was back in, I think, 2021 or 2022. We also, people like Avi, who exploited Mango DAO and things like that, like not technically a governance exploit, but very, very close. Especially people that took things like, on-chain governance to its like maximalist attitude, where once a vote has been passed, it becomes mandated by the protocol, and people figured out how to exploit those systems very, very quickly. This was a theme back in 2020, 2021. So yeah, like I think that the idea of a DAO is very attractive, right, and very appealing. But there's something about that friction between financial incentives and human nature that makes these things very difficult to sustain, I think, is the perspective that I'm going to take.
Well, and Mark, what you're using as your example for what works really well, you're saying a group of researchers are getting together and creating this sort of, plan, or not necessarily a plan, but they're the ones who are in the background doing this designing for different mechanisms. I think this might be the big difference too, is you're not talking about a token holder with maybe their own best interests in mind, because there is a difference between the actual success of a project, right, and what it offers and what it brings to the industry in general, and the price of the token that you hold. And I think maybe that's where this disconnect comes in with DAOs. From what I'm hearing you say, is that there's a difference in, who is actually qualified to be making these decisions when it comes to running one of these projects and designing, its potential future direction of, the entire project. Really, Angela, were you going to say something and I cut you off?
Yeah, I mean, Mark brought up some great examples of a very narrow and very wide decision space. So everybody's talking about, why does it work so well at Bitcoin, and why doesn't it work so well in other DAOs? And I think what we have to keep in mind is that what any node operator can, or miner can decide on Bitcoin, is a very narrow decision. Will you participate in the upgrade or not? And this is the decision to make. And there's a direct link between the incentives, so the revenues of miners, for example, in the system, and their decision. And that's what obviously works very well. And we have other DAOs where the decision space is so much wider. So like the DAO 2016, where the first idea of, couldn't a DAO, compared to Bitcoin, for example, do so much more, like create a whole landscape of applications on top of a protocol, or I don't know, reinvent the world. So what a DAO should do, and what the mission of a DAO is, and and then respectively what decisions have to be taken, has changed a lot. And there's a lot of experimentation of the scope of decisions in a DAO. And I think this is, of course, this can put you in troubles, because there might be decision makers who don't have the expertise, or you have low voter turnout. We have a perfect infrastructure basically for all sorts of bribery and collusion. We have anonymous wallets. We have DeFi building blocks that can be put on top of decision making, like we saw it on Arbitrum. And I think we just have to acknowledge this and shape the decision space. So what's decision should be made, what's the mission of a DAO accordingly. And I think the past years teach us a lot about what's a good decision space, what doesn't work so well, and also what's the potential of a DAO. Because even though we saw a lot of failures, I think there's still huge potential in DAOs that sets it apart from the traditional organizations we know today. And that's why I'm still excited about DAOs.
Yeah, and
acknowledging all the challenges.
I would like to add that I don't think my experience with DAOs in cryptocurrency specifically is necessarily representative of like how DAOs can function. So, for example, I think one of the best sort of open source community governed projects that we can reference is a 3D animation software called Blender, where people spend enormous amounts of time, and you need, like, this isn't sort of writing proposals or something. This is people who need to have an intimate knowledge of what it means to program 3D graphics. And then, essentially will either upload those things, to the Blender project for free for people to use, because it makes Blender a stronger project, or will participate in, business licensing and things like that, especially if it's, required significant investment from outside sources or something. But it runs like very, very well. There are a lot of things that Blender as a project sort of I don't know. There are certain things resplendent in Blender as a project that I wish there were more parallels with in DeFi. But that's not to say that I think DAOs are altogether a failure. One of the things that Angela has pointed out just now is that I think, to paraphrase her, is that when the decision-making process is relatively simple, especially when it's an opt-in, opt-out sort of situation, where you're not necessarily held to to whatever the DAO decides, you can go your own way. And we've seen this again and again in Ethereum, where even Ethereum Classic today, remains a perfectly valid blockchain. Some would argue that it's less relevant than the Ethereum main chain that we all know. But there are people within the Ethereum Classic community who may disagree with you, and that doesn't prevent Ethereum Classic from being a traded resource the same way ETH main is, and has its own projects developing on it. The same is true of Terra and Terra Classic, and the same is true of Ethereum proof of work and Ethereum proof of stake chains. I do like this idea that if you disagree with the decision, you can continue to operate in much the same way that it has been. The problem with projects operating within a blockchain is that you can't fork the blockchain, right, every time someone disagrees with the way a decision is going. I think that is a very specific problem. We have seen projects, fork themselves because of these kinds of issues, but it's rare and it's difficult to do. But yeah, it is a problem when you've got a very complex mechanism that requires an enormous amount of expertise. Projects like Blended seem to do it very well, but in the DeFi financial space, for whatever reason, we just haven't attracted the type of intellectual acumen that's required to understand these products and properly govern them.
Yeah.
When you're talking about Blender though, Mark, and maybe I just need a little bit of clarification. When you're talking about Blender, you're talking about the 3D animators who are building on their own and contributing something for others, making it available for others to use, right? It's not necessarily going in and changing anything about Blender or making a decision on the future of Blender. And I think that that's where I am finding this disconnect when I think of DeFi protocols.
I should clarify. No, there are definitely huge decisions made in Blender as to specific programming paradigms and things that it's adopting that end up irreversibly changing the Blender product itself.
And this is contributed by actual users of Blender. Okay.
Yes.
Interesting. I didn't realize that. I was thinking it's almost like what you were saying initially. It made me think of AI agents. And I know that this is a big discussion. It's a completely different discussion. Maybe we'll even touch on a little bit of AI in our call. But it made me think of agents. If somebody wanted to let's say, for example, Carbon DeFi doing something specific, and the developers weren't doing it themselves. Could a DAO member go in and create this agent to go and do something to add this feature into Carbon, for example? And maybe we'll touch on that after. Angela, you were going to say something yourself as well.
Yeah, I just want to build on, what decisions are made at Blender and why does it work so well? And one could say, if you narrow down the decision space to protocol upgrades, very technical in nature, very much limited by the scope and technical setup of a certain protocol, this could be ideal. I say there's another direction for DAOs that is really where decentralization is really a superpower, and this is innovation. We have been, or part of our work at GovXS was to observe how protocols nurture their ecosystem of infrastructure builder, roughly. And I think here decentralization is such a great asset. And if we think of, how do large organizations innovate? You usually, for example, in order to find new revenue streams or innovate on products or services, or even how venture capital firms decide on an investment, then decision-making is in small committees. So innovation and investment decisions are typically made by small and tightly knit groups. And I don't say that this doesn't make sense, because sometimes if you don't have clarity or evidence that something will work out, you have to take a risk, and then it can be better to take a decision in a small, very focused group. You also usually have a narrow scope and deep expertise, so clearly defined domain, specialized knowledge, industry-specific networks, or an investment thesis, and you operate in a certain cultural context. So decisions are shaped by the norms, assumptions, expectations of a certain specific cultural or institutional context. This is how decisions are made traditionally in large organizations. And this is good. However, it also creates fragility, because committees can become blind to shifts in the market or fail to adapt. And that's what we are seeing at the moment. Disruption from new technologies, or competitors like AI outpace existing mental models. And this is what we are observing today. Now you could say, but is it then really better if thousands of people try to come to a conclusion what to do next? Certainly not. But we can tackle this vulnerability of, okay, this strong internal alignment and historical success can make it harder to recognize where the game has changed via decentralized networks. And if we look at successful ecosystems today, then we see that there's continuous, constant experimentation, shipping new ideas. Many times it's very random, but sometimes it's really brilliant. These networks are quick to adapt to trends and technologies, as we're seeing it at the moment. And we've seen such rich grassroots activity in crypto networks, in building, also in educating, in organizing, in bringing people together. And this is a very fertile ground for new talent that I think is unmet by traditional organizations. So DAOs really create opportunities for unknown or early stage contributors and projects and ideas. And the onboarding is very simple. It's low entry barriers, diversity, open participation. And also what's going on is driven by a broader set of needs, right? So referring to cultural context or changing market sentiments, ideas. So these networks are very dynamic. And natively, it's about coordination. So we have already built and invented great tools for global coordination. And I think this is a superpower for DAOs. And this is certainly something that will have an impact, not only in the crypto sector. So bottom-up innovation, continuous and organic innovation. And that's something, of course, that can and should be experimented on, and where we can already draw a lot of insights on what we have learned so far in terms of challenges and how we can solve it.
Mark, I saw you nodding your head a couple times. I don't know if it was an agreement, but I'm curious, Angela had a lot to put out there. And when you're talking about like the bottom up innovation, especially when she's talking about this barrier to entry, right? You had said earlier, this was your way of really getting into, your position currently was through a DAO, was through your mathematics and everything that you were doing at the time, right? So I'm curious your thoughts. Do you see this as a superpower of DAOs currently, and do you see it continuing to be?
It is.
If so.
No, it absolutely is a superpower, but it's also a bad assumption. So I think, for example, I don't think you can decide to have a DAO. I think that DAOs happen or they don't. I think that, we all, for everyone that lives in a democracy, you kind of are already living in a DAO in a sense. Like there is, a decision process that influences government decisions and things like that. And sure, like there are centralized aspects to it, in terms of what governments reveal to the public and whatnot. But I think what I mean to say is that when everyone's well-being, or at least the people who are under a governance system, feel like their well-being is at stake, they tend to engage, right, in decision-making processes in a much more profound way. And whenever that happens, you generally end up with better decisions, right? Very few exceptions. Obviously there can be cultural and philosophical differences, and occasionally bad ideas do get through. But I would say in general, the more people that are participating in a decision process, in general, the better the decision ends up becoming. But you cannot force people to engage, especially when they don't feel like they have anything at stake. And I think this is this is one of the problems that DAOs have, is that there needs to be a starter motor or something, right? You need people to come to the cause and take it seriously. And when there aren't enough people doing that, those governance systems become more susceptible to attack, especially if the decentralization and participation in the governance structure is assumed. The more you hold that assumption close to your heart, the more likely it is that someone's going to exploit it. So no, I do think it's a superpower. It absolutely is. I'm just not sure that it's something that you can elect to do, right? It's kind of like saying, let's start a revolution, right? You can't just start one. People need to agree with you first, before it gathers momentum. And I think DAOs are very similar to that. And that's also why I think things like Bitcoin and Ethereum do so well, is that it rallied so many people behind those ideas that it became self-sustaining. But yeah, I think as a new project, to say we are going to have a DAO is a naive thing to say, because it assumes that people are going to want to be in your DAO. And of course, this is why things like incentive mechanisms and things are so important. But more than that, there is a more fundamental question to ask, which is, how necessary is your DAO? Because if people don't want to be a part of it, or if it's not, of wide appeal, then it's kind of dead on arrival, so to speak.
Absolutely. I think.
Oh, go ahead, Angela.
I mean, the key problem or the misconception for DAOs over the past years was that it's just so cool, exciting, amazing to be part of a DAO, and everybody will be happy to contribute and take part and participate in decision making. That this is a value in itself. And for me, it's totally obvious that the incentives have to be aligned. And in the physical world, there's a lot at stake for you if the place where you live and where you work is in danger, and that gives you a good reason to participate. It might be not the same in digital worlds. And I think this is highly underrated. So what's the skin in the game for everybody? What's the benefits? And what are the incentives to participate? And I think that's in fact a key problem. But let's just say a protocol or an ecosystem manages to provide value, so they find product market fit, and you try to innovate, then I still believe the decentralized way has huge potential compared to the traditional, okay, we define a strategy, and then we select some projects, or we run a competition or so. And I brought two examples for typical challenges and how they are approached at the moment, where we try to find new routes for better decision making and better governance. Stop for a moment, Jen.
Yeah, no, just a question. We're talking about incentives, right? The incentives need to be aligned for anybody to want to actually participate in your DAO. when we speak about incentives, maybe I think of, back in 2020 and DeFi summer and incentives and, that word, it's just kind of like, ooh, incentives. How do you actually attract the people that you want to participate in your DAO through these incentives? Because I think incentives programs, a lot of them, historically in the last 5 years, have not really, one, been sustainable, have really proven to bring that value long term, and to maintain that sort of initial attraction that it has, when it's first announced. Like we see liquidity miners, we see a lot of people going from blockchain to blockchain, and that's all because of the incentives. So when it comes down to decision making, how do you use incentives to attract the actual qualified, and I say qualified, but those who are going to make those decisions or have that sort of knowledge to be able to even make those decisions?
Cool question. If I say incentives, I don't mean, okay, provide some rewards, throw some tokens for pushing a button or so. If I talk incentives, I mean align incentives, make the interests of the individual stakeholder aligned with growing the ecosystem. And this happens if you, as an individual, depend either with your business or with your technology on, for example, a protocol. You depend on it. You couldn't work without it. You couldn't make profits without it. You couldn't grow your company, your network, your community without it. So we have a certain skin in the game, and you have a high interest to make it better, to cater your needs even better than today. And these two ingredients, you have skin in the game, there's something to lose, and you have an idea what's the right direction for you to benefit from it, is this aligning of incentives I'm talking about. And I think we also, I had recently a discussion about network states and the idea that we could create digital states and have a new form of citizenship. And I think this refers to DAOs very swiftly try to replicate nation states as the place where I have citizen rights, maybe with the idea that everybody would be equivalently active or committed to contribute just because you're a citizen of something. But the physical world has totally different dependencies when it comes to individual versus a nation state, or the digital world, a wallet addressed to a network state. And I think the power of this, creating these ties and the commitment, is different and maybe much harder to achieve in the digital world. And that's why I'm thinking about this. Okay, how can I become, as a protocol, really critical for my stakeholders, and vice versa? How can they have an impact to make it better for them? Are the two ingredients if I talk about aligning incentives.
Understood. Thank you for clarifying. Mark, anything that you want to add before I move on to another question of mine?
No, I mean, I agree. Yeah, I think that the way that Angela is using the incentives word is the one that we should all be using, right? Which is, this idea that the way that protocols or products, whatever vernacular that we want to use, the way that they should operate, and the communities that they serve are somehow interlinked. That you have people who are actually benefiting from the way that something operates, determining how it operates. Like that's I think a very good philosophy to adopt. I think it is also worth acknowledging that what gave Jen pause when the word incentives was brought up, which is that it's very difficult to talk about these things without someone immediately assuming that it's some project handing out token rewards or something to its community for participating a certain way.
That they're getting
And I
paid
think
for
that
it.
they're getting paid for it. And in some sense, that's what people expect. One of the things that I have spoken about on many occasions is that in some ways the industry has only itself to blame. I think for the state of things. When we were in this very steep ascent on the Gartner hype cycle back in 2019, 2020, that everyone was just printing tokens and distributing them to people to come and use their protocols and things like that. We attracted the wrong demographic, right? Like when you do these kinds of things, you end up calling mercenaries into the system. And now that they're here and it's the only people that are listening, I don't think that we should act too surprised when the people that you've paid, to listen to you are expecting to continue to be paid. It does, I think, it does inspire some optimism that most of these systems have at least been relaxed, if not been completely retired. And it gives some room for the kinds of people to show up that will respond to the sorts of incentive designs that Angela is talking about. And I think that that's the point that I'm trying to make, is that there are two different kinds of people. The people that understand incentives as, this is how much I'm going to pay you. And people that understand incentives as, this is how your experience or your life will be impacted by the decisions that you're making. And
Now,
we did everything in
uh,
our power to exclude one of those demographics back in 2019, 2020. It did a lot of damage. And it's taking, years and years to sort of reverse the effects of that. And I don't think that we're all the way there. But certainly there are signs of healing.
so then, we've kind of made it clear there's a certain type of person, certain qualifications that we would want, people to have if they're going to be participating in the DAO, and, these incentives are aligned, right? Are there that many people in the industry right now, and how do we find them? Like, maybe that's like a blunt way of asking, but really, when the builders, all of the builders are building their own projects, right? And we see a lot of the competition. We see a lot of these things. I know, a lot of builders will fork a project and now it's competition. We want innovation, right? But we see limited innovation and limited collaboration. And we see, maybe I am, from my end anyway, I'm seeing more of that type of user and, I guess user, yeah, within our industry right now that is looking for the other type of incentive. Right. So how do we find those people that you guys are speaking about, and how do we get them to really participate in the DAO?
I would say, okay, let's take a look at cases where it really works well and then derive insights for what is the right DAO folks to attract. And there are super interesting developments on merging data and AI to avoid or deal with some of the challenges you mentioned. So, for example, we have popularity contests and not enough people with the right knowledge to take a good decision. People are biased, loudest voices are heard, most prominent projects are supported, and that's it. And this is frustrating, and this is actually not leveraging the superpower that I was talking about. Okay, let's think of, okay, in what context can we put this example, project funding for crypto protocols. So they are looking for what teams are building great infrastructure on top of our protocol to cater the use cases, again, to make it better for the actual users, for the actual B2B, B2C clients. Now, there is the idea of ground truth in epistemic democracy. So there's a real world truth about all kinds of political matters that we can reveal or at least best estimate, by a democratic process, by a voting. And this, I guess, was the starting point, democratic voting on selecting the best projects to support and fund in our ecosystem. A very typical DAO example that we've seen many, many times in the ecosystem. But voters can be biased, and it ends up to be a popularity contest. Now, the latest approaches are to take or to design voting processes where we merge subjective preferences by voters with metrics, data and evaluation algorithms, and then algorithmically decide on the funds distribution so that voters decide on the what and the why, which I think is a very good decision to make still for human actors in the system. And then the how much is decided by data and algorithms or even AI. And what's important to understand here, this is good or great application cases require that we have some evidence to measure, because if we just make up some numbers, we could end up again in a popularity contest. So we try to quantify value add, and we have to have evidence to measure. And we can either say, okay, this is on past achievements like retroactive funding at Optimism, for example, and also Filecoin did retro funding rounds, or even to predictions about projects' achievements in the future, integrating predictive mechanism like prediction markets, where those who are making predictions have skin in the game as well, and they lose with wrong predictions and they gain with the right predictions. So we have two routes to create data for metrics-based voting, as we call it, retroactive funding, evidence for achievements in the past, or value added in the past, and predictions. And then from there, voters decide on the what, the purpose, and the respective metrics. So it could be voters in an ecosystem discuss if TVL is a good way to measure value add, token value locked. It's a very popular metric, but maybe not always the best one. It can be also users. It can be like deep funding's dependency graphs. So what libraries and what code repositories define the value and add to the value of Ethereum, another form of data, or transaction volume associated with certain projects, or it even can be reputation via, in TE Academy's case, NFT proofs. Okay, voters decide on metrics and the purpose. Then we measure metrics. And usually we need evaluation algorithms, we need the data source, we need a certain granularity of data, how to compute a score. So if, for example, looking at TVL, should we use the native currency or should we use USD value? And looking at the exchange rates today, this makes a huge difference. So we need to tweak the algorithms to define value add and to measure value add. Should we simply sum up values, or should we better look at trends? Should we look at total users? Should we look at recurring users? So you get the idea. We refine the algorithms, and then in a third step, voters ongoingly or iteratively, cycle by cycle, vote on the weight of a certain metric and evaluation algorithm, and then the algorithm computes the funding outcome. And again, the idea is to have evidence and process evidence in a voting process while voters focus on the purpose. And we merge both and try to get better decisions that are less biased, reduce also the, let's say, the mental load for voters, because they don't take decisions on the exact algorithm, they focus on the purpose or do calculations, and we make voting more efficient. This is one route. And the second one is the problem of low voter turnout, or the lack of experts to take certain decisions. And there are also very exciting experiments currently going on where we have experts who vote on just a sample of projects. So funding rounds for, if we've seen observing optimism, for example, we have thousands of projects applying for funding. So how should a voter go through all these applications from a diverse scope and technology target groups? This is impossible. So we need, number one, we need smaller voting rounds, more focused, and then experts even only vote on a sample of the decisions of the projects. And then we take models who try to meet the preferences of voters best. And there's currently a competition going on at Deep Funding to explore how we can integrate AI and agents to this voting process, where step one is we have a dependency graph, as I mentioned, Ethereum, the core repositories, and the library dependencies. And this ends in thousands of connections between the seed nodes and these libraries. And then the weights are defined by machine learning models and compared to find the best model compared with experts' assessment of these repositories, and to end up in a funds distribution to fund the infrastructure necessary to grow Ethereum. And these are two examples where we can increase the efficiency and precision and have less biased voting designs. I think totally the right direction when it comes to innovation.
Mark, I'm curious your thoughts on what Angela was saying. And Angela, it's all super interesting. I know I have a question that may be relevant to both of you, but Mark, do you have thoughts on this? These sorts of models and ideas that Angela is talking about right now?
I think it's very important. Like I absolutely applaud this kind of this kind of approach. You know, I think with respect to the question that you asked that prompted Angela's answer, you know, one of the things that I was going to say is that I think that what cryptocurrency and blockchain has been lacking for the last few years is kind of a sense of meritocracy. And, you know, Angela pointed a few different times to this idea that things usually devolve into some sort of popularity contest, and I agree with her. Where, you know, one of the issues that we have today in DeFi especially is that, you know, whoever has the best smile, right, is going to be the person that ends up getting funded. And, you know, whoever is the most charming or whatever, the people that know how to talk to VCs or who are well connected or politically aligned are generally the people that are going to be able to push projects that garner the most attraction, even if it's only in the short term. And there's very little, you know, in the way of, I'd say, critical discourse. You know, I think one of the things that's been massively lacking from, especially from DeFi, but cryptocurrency in general, is the, you know, there's this void of where I would consider editorial oversight to be extremely important. This is one of the things I've said for years. You know, I've remarked previously, especially on calls with Octopus, who Angela and I both know very well, that there has been this conflation of marketing hubris and legitimate research over the last few years. And it's very difficult to determine the difference between these two things. Very recently, I was contacted by a project who was interested in the arbitrage fastlane, right, which is a technology that the Bancor has been working on now for a couple of different years, and, you know, was asking us to integrate with their DEX. And I said, great, you know, you show me the docs, and I couldn't work out how their protocol worked, right? Like, they have a whole, like, you know, pages and pages of developer documentation that's nothing but ChatGPT written marketing documents. You know, there's nothing in there about how their protocol operates. And that has become status quo. Now, that wouldn't fly if this was pharmaceuticals. You know, the pharmaceuticals industry runs entirely on, and just, I realize that's a politicized topic more now than it used to be. But, the pharmaceuticals industry actually does make, an enormous amounts of effort and invests huge amounts of money in making sure their drugs work the way that they're supposed to work. And they do that first, right? Before they, take to late night, infomercials about, ask your doctor before prescribing whatever. And DeFi doesn't. It does the opposite. It generally invests everything in marketing first and then decides what their protocol should do, or if it should do anything at all, which is entirely backwards. There is like I did find very recently that there are a small group of people out of the University of Pittsburgh who have started publishing a journal called Ledger, which is dedicated to cryptocurrency and these kinds of things, cryptography. And I think that we need more of that. And I would hope that that kind of, like I said, editorial oversight, where there is an authority in the room, not necessarily an authority, but let's say a respected figure, someone whose opinion matters to people, that can say, no, what these guys are saying is bullshit, or this idea actually holds water. And the problem with that perspective is that it's very much at ends with the cryptocurrency and blockchain ethos, which is that we should reject this idea of an authority telling us what to think or how to feel. I used to agree with that ethos, and I think the last few years has kind of spun me around on that idea that crowds in general aren't very good at that I'd say crowds are good at making decisions, but they're not very good at thinking. And I don't think that that's controversial. Like a 1,000 people in a room together, can be very noisy and aren't necessarily going to, be very good at, coming to agreement on a complex issue. Think of your stepfather shouting at you to leave him alone in the garage or something so that he can focus on working on the car by himself, sort of thing. If you put 100 different, toddlers in the garage with him, he's not going to fix the car any faster, and they're not going to be able to help him, fix the car. Whereas if there were 2 or 3 mechanics in the room with him, that actually might, precipitate the process a little bit. But you need someone to help discern who the mechanics are and who the children are. And for that, unfortunately, we do need this kind of meritocracy. And something about that always feels elitist, and it makes me sort of feels icky when I talk about it. But yeah, I do believe that there is kind of a need for authority, and to help us, to help the crowd discern reality from their imagination. It's becoming more apparent to me, this year than last year, and it seems to be getting worse with time.
I just realized that we are at the top of the hour, so I don't know if either of you have a hard stop right now. But I mean, I definitely want to continue the conversation, whether it's for the next few minutes or it's an entirely, a part 2, a continuation of this. But I mean, I know I have questions of my own, especially as we really kind of dive more into the discussion. Angela, you were going to say something. Are both of you okay for another couple of minutes, or do either of you have to drop? It's fine.
No, I can.
Yeah, Mark
I
is
don't have
bringing up
anything.
Okay.
Topics worth discussing. So I
Yeah.
wouldn't say, maybe to round up this part of the conversation and discussion, and it's certainly worth giving it more time at any other day. And I would not. I mean, you say authority or meritocracies. I would say it depends. I mean, I still think that I talked about this superpower of innovation and having this wide network, so many diverse perspectives to find a ground truth. I think what's important to keep in mind, for me, the solution is not always authority. It can be some cases, but I would love to maintain this perspective of a big network is an asset in itself and its value. Don't underrate it. It has to be, let's say, we have to find new ways. And number one, incentive alignment. So voter incentives are not paying voters to vote. Participation incentives is to align the interests of the stakeholders, no matter what they expect, what they do in a network, and the whole ecosystem. And you have to find routes for incentive alignment. And if they have an interest because they depend on a protocol, they have a reason to participate. And it should not be the incentive itself, participation. Say something. They should have a reason to participate. This is number one. Just want to round this up. And then second, I think there's a huge potential in expert perspective where it's needed, and then try to be as efficient as possible. And there are huge efficiency gains through data, machine learning, and AI. And we are just starting this. And here, the fact that we have digital networks and that we have crypto networks is perfect. I mean, this is the perfect starting ground for and experimentation ground for solutions experimenting with, okay, subjective preferences, expert perspective, plus scaling it up using data ML. This is the second. And the third is, of course, decision space. Leverage or try to capture many voices where many voices really add value. I was talking about finding this ground truth, and this can be important and very valuable, but maybe it's not necessary in every case. And if we want to have ground truth, then try to complement it with objective data, because it simply will make your decisions better and more reliable as well.
So yeah, there's something I wanted to raise there, and it speaks to I'd say like a much broader, I don't want to call it a problem or an issue. Let's call it a conflict, right? In way that not just DAOs are on, but in all human, decision making and subjection in reality happens. And without I have absolutely no interest in politicizing this conversation, but to choose a contemporary example, the Trump administration, really did put forth this kind of tariffs idea very, very early on. It's very difficult to be critical of anything that Trump has done in terms of, delivering on election promises, because he's done nothing but deliver on election promises. And it's rare, right, for a politician to be as fast, in enacting exactly what his election platform promised to do. One of the reason I bring up the tariffs thing is because a lot of people, I don't want to say a majority necessarily, because I have absolutely no data on this, but like a lot, if it is a minority, it's a significant minority, thought that tariffs was something that you charge other countries, right? Not the citizens of the United States, right? Like most people just voted to improve, to increase their own taxes by 50%, which means that they didn't even understand what they were voting for. And this is true of any incentive structure. Is that there is always an implicit understanding, in some cases an explicit understanding, that the people that are in control of those incentive mechanisms even understand what they are. And the reason I bring up the tariffs thing in the United States is just because we have very recent evidence to the contrary, that people will vote for things even if it's not in their best interest, or that they've been told that it's in their best interest, even by, it doesn't even have to be by the Trump administration themselves, but just by people around them, that this is what they should do. And they do it even if the incentives are to do the exact opposite. And it's a very interesting, paradigm, because at some point, no matter, which position you take on these issues, the underlying assumption is that people are smart enough to understand what they're participating in. And sometimes that's a good assumption, and sometimes it isn't.
yeah, I'm trying to figure out how I could envision a tariff system that integrates metrics-based voting, where voters vote on the most, we want to benefit from
I had a
tariffs, and
conversation.
then
I literally had a
algorithms
conversation about this
define
last week. Yeah,
and algorithms define what would be the most suitable tariff per case, and probably would land at slightly different results than what we are seeing today. But you know what I mean. Number
I
one,
do.
here
And
data and
yeah,
algorithms could help, and two, maybe in an optimal DAO, it would be possible also for the community to roll back decisions, while at the moment we
right.
don't know how to roll back as a community.
No, and so like, yeah, I literally had this conversation last week. With something like, it turns out I discovered at some level I would love a dictatorship, if it was like a purely impartial, something like a supercomputer AI,
Mm,
that always made the best decision for like the majority of people at all times. Like that, it's kind
mm,
of an ideal situation. And the
mm,
reason why I ended up leaning authoritarian, which is extremely, like, I'm doing some soul searching now because I consider myself a libertarian. Um, but it's because I was looking at a bunch of different examples where even when someone is presented with the best possible decision, like provably the best decision, they will vote against it, right? Like even if you had the data, like even if there was this machine
mm,
learning algorithm and things
mm.
where it said, here is unequivocally, no questions about it, the best answer, people will still claim the earth is flat.
Yeah,
Like
this is human decision irrationality, and I guess that I believe that we won't get over human irrationality. Then it's best to get rid of human decisions altogether. Either we accept it to have it and maybe see it as something valuable as well. Like as a human, you are not fully rational, and or we replace it. Um, Probably case by case decision.
It's interesting. Like now there's a whole nother thing to talk about, and that's actually full blown replacing human decision making with these sorts of models that you're talking about creating. It's like a whole nother, I won't say
I would never.
extreme to
It's
it.
extreme. I would never support it, by the way, because you can never trust that the thing that you've put in place to make everyone's decisions for them, isn't under somebody else's influence and things like that. So like the libertarian in me still wins out, but I did have to
Mm.
concede that that there are so many examples where you cannot trust people to make good decisions. Even things like there's something called the Monty Hall problem, which is a very very simple statistics problem
Mm.
about doors and goats and millions of dollars at stake. And even though you can show people exactly what the right decision is, they still kind of distrust it, or they've got like this gut reflex that always leads them in the wrong direction, or like more often than not leads them in the wrong direction. And yeah, it just draws attention to this idea that that if you assume that people are rational, it's the same with markets, right? You just can't assume that the market is efficient and rational, and the same is true of human decision making, and those two things are intimately related.
I mean, we should not forget that simply there are decisions on Earth that cannot be answered by yes or no, and also where we simply don't have data and ratio to take a decision because they are simply ethical decisions. And this can be in technical systems as well, where the car decides on uh, who has to die because there are pedestrians left and right, and what route to take. So I think this is something we won't get rid of, but there are certainly decisions to be taken where rationality is utterly important, and there we can find new routes to the degree rationality should lead, or human irrationality might play a role, or ethics are important. And I think
All
this
important.
is not new. It's just we have new tools at hand and have to see where and how to apply them.
I think that's really what it is. It's not like this has been a secret, right? If you've been involved in any sort of a decision-making process, and we're speaking about DAOs specifically, but really a decision-making process. I mean, from the time I was in school, it's prom king and queen. It's all like popularity and like we said earlier, who's the loudest, But now is really where these new tools and things come in. We do have to wrap this up, but I do want to invite you guys to come back on, have the continued conversation. Before we wrap it up, though, Angela, you had mentioned ETHCC earlier in the call. Let's just bring it back to this. I know I want to connect again before ETHCC, but Token Engineering is having a dedicated track at ETHCC regarding this very sort of, this very topic. Am I correct? Maybe give us a little bit more and give our viewers a little more.
Yeah, there are two exciting ways to connect with the community again and continue this discussion. Number one, on incentive mechanism design in the crypto sector generally, not related necessarily only to governance, to many other application cases, be it DeFi, be it RWA. And this is on June 30th at ETHCC in Cannes, France, the token engineering track. Speaker applications are open as well. Check out ethcc.io, buy your ticket, be there, mark your calendar, and see you there, the token engineering track. And second, on July 1st, we'll host breakout sessions to discuss the latest developments in DAO governance. And we'll focus on new mechanisms and new experiments to learn from communities who applied metrics-based voting, who applied AI agents in a voting setup to better understand and discuss what we can learn from these first experiments. July 1st, also at ETHCC. Good reasons to come to Cannes.
There's so many good reasons to go. And Mark, I know you're going to be participating in that as well with Angela and Token Engineering. So anybody who is looking to attend, you'll get the chance to meet both of them. And where would they find the application? You said you're still accepting, speaker applications. Would they find that on the ethcc.io?
Right. ethcc.io, you'll find speaker application form. There's still time for anybody working on incentive mechanisms. And I'd like to highlight the deep funding experiment. If you go to deep funding and Allo Capital, Google it, and I guess we can share some links later. The model contest for building models to distribute funding to the Ethereum code repositories and contributors is also still open until June. I think another great opportunity to try out new tools, how they can be applied to governance. So if you are into machine learning, building AI agents, definitely check it out.
Amazing. Thank you. You'll share those links with me after, and I can make sure that share them on all of our, sources here with our broadcast. Thank you so much for joining. Really, I thought it was going to be an interesting conversation. I really kind of wanted to dive into it, but it turned into so much more than just like our DAOs Dead. So I really want to thank you both for such a wonderful conversation. And I really do look forward to the part 2. I'm going to add all of the links. Thank you to all of our viewers as well. Angela and Mark, always a pleasure. Thank you so much. We'll connect and we'll schedule our to be continued.
Thanks for having me today. Talk soon.
Always
Thank you.
a pleasure. Thank you. We'll talk to you guys soon.